kick off and do an intro to myself, and I've got the great privilege of facilitating today's session. My name is Rennie. I'm a director at Deloitte. I focus on financial services. I also sit with Jason on the FinTech New Zealand board, so really privileged to be here today to facilitate this session for you. Joining me on the stage here, they'll introduce themselves as we go along, but I have Ralph Bragg and Colin Wallis, and then we have Adrian Smith joined in the background there, dialing in remote. So I will pass over to Ralph, and he can do a little intro to himself, and then we'll go along the line.
Thanks, Holly. Ralph Bragg, founder of Radiam Services Limited. For my sins, I was the Open Banking UK Trust Framework Ecosystem Architect, the Open Banking Brazil Trust Framework Ecosystem Architect and Solution Designer, the Open Insurance Ecosystem in Brazil Solution Designer, the Central Bank of the UAE Trust Framework and Ecosystem Solution Designer for Open Banking, as well as been heavily involved in the delivery of Connect ID, which is the Australian Payments Plus's digital identity ecosystem. Most of those ecosystems are using services and capabilities that we designed originally in the UK and have now been delivering into a variety of different markets around the world.
So that's a hard act to follow, isn't it? So I'm not even going to try. My name's Colin Wallis. I'm the Executive Director of Digital Identity New Zealand. Ralph and I actually met in the UK. In my previous gig, I was the Executive Director of an international organisation called Kantara Initiative. It was US incorporated, but I was actually running it from the UK, global perspective. We first met in the sort of kind of the open banking fora. In fact, actually, it was actually at an open identity exchange event, and if you follow anything to do with digital identity these days, you'll hear that with regrets, the OIX actually closed its doors on Saturday, so that's not so good. So there go, by the grace of God, all non-profits who tread down this path. I've been the executive director since 2021, or late 2021. Digital Identity New Zealand itself began in 2019, so been with it a little while. Passing on to you.
Over to Adrian.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, thumbs up, cool. Kia ora koutou, ko Adrian Klukuingo, ko taku mahi ki BlinkPay, ko te Chief Product Officer and Co-Founders. So I'm Adrian Smith, the Chief Product Officer of the Māori FinTech BlinkPay. And we are deeply and heavily immersed in the open banking standard and the development of those standards, as well as the development of new capabilities, products and services for Aotearoa. So I'll be bringing the very hardcore small guy startup fintech needs. Kia ora.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adrian. And Adrian and I go back a long way to our days at Barclays in the UK, where we worked together on a lot of the open banking initiatives back in the UK as well. So, look, we'll get started. And as I said, please do send through questions as you think of them. We'd love to hear from you. So, I mean, let's start with the very topical news around the Commerce Commission findings that have just been released recently. A key headline and finding within there is that the slow progress of open banking here in New Zealand, and without regulatory backstop, what is driving that pace of change or the lack of that pace of change. So Adrian, I'll come to you first, if that's okay. Do you agree with this view that there has been slow progress and the lack of regulatory support?
So for context, BlinkPay is a startup, and because we like to be quick and nimble, we will always take the view that things are going too slowly. Having said that, we feel like there are 5 core things that have contributed to this, notably, number 1, we feel like there's an unconscious bias towards consensus decision-making across the industry. And yet, rather paradoxically, number 2 is there's a desire to relitigate past decisions, which I find to be at odds on various occasions. Probably the third thing we'd highlight is there are differing interpretations of the standard and the attendant obligations. One of these things I say to my developers is we tend to have a lot of non-standard versions of the standard that we're dealing with. And so I think that's an area we could potentially sharpen up with that could increase velocity and quality and consistency of experience. I think the fourth thing we would highlight is there are differing risk appetites within each of the API providers, and as a consequence, each person, because they're in a regulated industry, and I have a lot of heart for that, highlight a big bank life. Each bank draws a line as to where the risk line is and then determines how far away they wish to be from that or how close. And some have greater risk appetite than others, which then leads to different conversations. And then the fifth part that I would sort of attribute to the speed or lack thereof is the siloed regulators engaging in activities that cause industry to slow down and pause as we collectively assess, well, what will this mean for the development and execution of the open banking standard? And so it's those 5 factors that we feel are some of the biggest contributing factors into the relative speed of New Zealand versus other international jurisdictions, Holly.
Thank you, Adrian. Ralph, do you have anything to add to that?
No, and not really, to be honest. Adrian's 5 points are very well founded, and you do see those in markets where there is sometimes not an active recognition of the role that a regulator has to play. So a couple of cases in point, Brazil was able to do in 12 months what the UK took 5 years to go and implement in open insurance, and Brazil was able to do in 6 months what was the same sort of size of scope of implementation. Connect ID likewise was a matter of weeks comparison to the other ecosystems that have gone before, and each of those subsequent ecosystems have recognised the interoperability imperative, that it doesn't really matter what data that you're sharing. It doesn't matter if it's insurance, banking, telco, healthcare, digital identity, unless you have someone that is going to have a laser sharp focus and drive on interoperability, and that is both from a regulatory point of view, a commercial point of view, and a technical standards point of view. You don't really have open banking. You have what Adrian's had to deal with, which is 4 different integrations with 4 different providers, and that makes quite a challenging market for New Zealand. If you're talking about open banking, you've got 3 to 5 million people. You don't have one market until you have open banking, until you lay the digital railroads consistently and everybody is using those same standard gauge and everyone has measured the standard gauge of railroad tracks to confirm that it is exactly the right dimensions. You're not going to attract a huge amount of investment. You're not going to bring fintechs overseas from overseas here to offer new value services because, well, you don't have one market. You've got a complete fragmented market with 4 different implementations that everybody has to fight through just to get to the starting line. And that's one of the challenges you certainly see with talking to a lot of the fintechs here, is that it's a fight just to get to the starting line.
Thank you. So some of the submissions to the market study have suggested that the June 2026 deadline for fully operational may be too unrealistic. So I'm keen, Colin, to get your perspectives on, are we expecting too much from our financial institutions here in New Zealand to meet that deadline?
Well, can I start with perhaps just a small comment on what Ralph and Adrian have...
Of course.
Of course, it's still a hard act to follow, right? So what I would say is that, hindsight, 2020 hindsight's a great thing, right? I think everyone, if they had their time again, would do this differently. Certainly, we've seen that in the identity space, and I'm sure it's the same in open banking. If you were trying to sort of describe it in a nutshell, we lacked the kind of orchestration. There was no sort of kind of detailed, I think, a detailed vision of how the moving parts would work together. And as a consequence, we're kind of left with this, this fragmented stop-start, and look, perhaps that's partly to do with the fact that, that there wasn't a regulator. And, I think it's great that, that route was taken, but there are places where a regulator is needed to sort of nudge things along, and of course they have. But to Ralph's point, there was that that stop start. Let's check what this means and so on. So yeah, I think that's I fully support those. Are we expecting too much? The reason why I went back is because I really want to give the context to answering this, and I suppose, are we expecting too much for the 2026 deadline? when you look back at, how many years is now? 5, a few more, yeah, something like that. You could say, well, why couldn't we be ready by June 2026? I mean, the elapsed time is reasonable, reasonable. The problem is that over half of that, 2/3 of that time has been too little progress has been made on that period. So you're left with, so easy to say, well, just hurry up, just do everything faster. But it's sometimes not actually feasible to do that. If you imagine the resource triangle, if you're trying to do something in less time, you need to throw more resources at it. And certainly Payments New Zealand have people working hard at the extra specifications, but there's a whole lot of things that are playing in here. And we're talking of fragmentation and lack of orchestration. We've got the Consumer Product and Data Bill coming through, right? And that's sort of coming, these things are just sort of kind of variations, at least on the same theme. They're almost profiles of each other. They're so close. And so you can imagine that the banks will be pausing and thinking, well, what's the implication of the rate of CPD coming in? What's that going to do to our project plan? So there's a sort of a classic case where you've got this, you've got the players not necessarily always in unison all of the time. So I actually think, long way to give you a short answer, I actually think that it's going to be quite challenging. To be honest, I think certainly, I think Kiwibank has already publicly announced that they will struggle with the time. I think some of those folks have done the minimal, the open banking minimal implementation. At least it's, they're further along the track. It might be possible, I think, but I think the other thing is, and we may have a chance to talk about this, is that there are other aspects that are hardly ever talked about, and Ralph just touched on it with the interoperability. The fact that you've got this sort of kind of slightly different aspects, different profiles, different lenses into the same banking standard, into the same open banking standard set. You need to have, basically an interoperability test match effectively to put those things together. Will they actually come out with the same responses? Will they understand each other and so on? So there's a lot of work still to be done. Let's not kid ourselves. And June 2026 is not far away. So I would say challenging.
Okay, and I think Ralph might have a slightly different perspective.
Controversial, maybe. Brazil. 200 banks in an open banking framework, currently with an 89% conformance and certification pass rate. Did it in 12 months. Why can't New Zealand? So I'm just going to ask that, it's a genuine question to the audience. We hear kind of consistent arguments to say, no, I can't do it, it's too confusing, it's not possible, it's too expensive. And a lot of the arguments that keep being made are, well, let's look at our brethren in the UK. Let's look over the ditch and see just how well Australia implemented it, which isn't great. However, those two markets, particularly the UK, was done 7 years ago. By not reinventing the wheel and learning what has gone on before, Brazil, not exactly at the moment, when they started this program, the technology titan powerhouse that it's grown into, now has 200 banks compliant, and they're able to do it with a variety of different implementations, all with a mixed mash of either vendor-led products, homegrown solutions, and they're able to deliver it in time and to a very, very high standard of conformance and certification. So if they can do it, and the UAE can do it, and other markets can do it, and the Australian banks with Connect ID can do it, why can't New Zealand banks?
Sorry, how? Not what for the key that is in.
Great question. I think you actually got that question.
I did have that question, so let's go straight to that.
It's a fantastic question. The first thing that the Brazilians did was that they started with it from a position of knowledge. They had a very strong regulator that was highly technical, having just launched the PIX account-to-account payments system, which was a major disruptor for and boon for the Brazilian digital economy. So a highly technical and capable regulator. So when we were approached by the regulator to come and train them, I had a introduction to open banking. This is what an ASPSP is, this is what a TPP is, this is how it all fits together. And they stopped me during the first sort of series of 12 workshops, and they said, can we do some introductions first? And I said, yeah, sure, no problem, who's in the room? Everyone was in the room. Legal, compliance, customer experience, enforcement, security, you name it, from the central bank, they were there. And they were all vested in making this ecosystem happen. And then they said, can we show you what it looks like? And I said, sorry, excuse me, you're a regulator. You don't build technology. And they said, no, we built it. We got our guys together and we've built a sort of, here's a model of a bank, and here's some fintechs, and here's some directories, and a bit of rudimentary PKI. And this is all how it all seems to work, right? Right, there goes lessons 1 through 3 of my training program for the regulator. And then the key thing they recognised was interoperability. It didn't matter what they were going to do, they needed to be interoperable. And they also wanted to make sure that they were going to lower the cost of implementation for their member firms, because they wanted those banks to be concentrating on delivering value-added services, deliver functional APIs, talk about what you're going to put on your railroad tracks, not the dimensions of the railroad, not the the curvature or the steel that's going to be used in terms of building those railroad tracks. So they started from the UK, and they took the UK standards and specifications and they fixed them. And it was a great opportunity for me, because I got to fix and help them fix all the stuff that they'd broken or we didn't get right the first time round. And that also meant they got to pick up every single one of the vendors and implementations and libraries and certified solutions that had been made available for the UK market into the Brazil market. Massive standing start for that ecosystem. Highly competent regulator, and a very, very, and a very clear direction on interoperability. And that also included global interoperability. Unlike the Australian standards, which were a nice little fork off to the right, the Brazilians aligned to the clear direction of international standards and international standardization for how to deliver data sharing ecosystems. They also recognized that the data sharing ecosystem they were laying had absolutely nothing to do with banking. Zero. None of what we're doing in laying these railroad tracks has anything to do with the actual payloads that goes on those train tracks. That's the 5%. That's the easy part. So when the minister this morning was talking about energy or telco or all these other sectors, really it's who cares? If you get your railroad tracks sorted, if you get your foundations sorted, and you get your principles sorted, well, you can put whatever you like on these railroad tracks, including digital identity, because digital identity, we're talking about that as later on, it's just another payload using the same standards on which all of these data sharing ecosystems go here, laid on. In the UK, the open banking security profile literally has a placeholder section still today, because I left it there, that says bank digital identity goes here. Really disappointing. One of the biggest regrets I've got personally, because it's in the specification. It literally says, slot your claims in here. Given name, first name, last name, date of birth, blah, 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 blah. And it just fits inside that data sharing ecosystem. It is all the same. And if we if we recognize that these data sharing ecosystems fundamentally are all the same in every jurisdiction, well, that's a real benefit for an accelerator for the delivery of whatever data or services you actually want to deliver into those ecosystems. It also really unlocks, New Zealand fintech, both outbound and inbound. It really starts fostering, the potential for cross-border digital services, the ability to execute confirmation of payee or in international banking payments between, say, the Australian the Australian AP Plus network and, say, the Payments NZ or CPB ecosystem that gets spun up here. That's fundamentally how Brazil. Oh yeah, and the other one was a laser sharp focus on interoperability. So the regulator stood up and mandated the creation of a conformance and certification program. And I just want to talk 10 seconds on this. There's no point writing a standard as Adrian's worked out. There's no point writing a standard because he ends up with 5 different implementations. That means you need someone to write a test suite, and that test suite has to be written by someone who's preferably independent from the standards creator. It also means you need to have some sandboxes. And then you need to have a flywheel, and this is where the regulators come in, and you need to have a flywheel that makes them all go round. So when the tests are created and somebody finds a gap or a misimplementation or a misinterpretation, the standards are fixed. And then the reference bank is fixed. And then the tests are fixed, which finds more problems with the standards. And so the standards are fixed, and then the bank is fixed, and the tests are fixed, and around we go. And without a regulator or someone that is really driving towards that high degree of interoperability and is laser sharp focused on that interoperability imperative, you will never get open banking. You'll never get, we would never have the internet. I'll use another 30-second analogy. Do you guys remember in the 1990s, they had all these websites that said, this page works best with Netscape Communicator. This page works best with Internet Explorer. Where did they go? Where did those little labels go? Does anyone know where those labels go? When? Anyone at all? The W3C got together and said, actually, we really should be concentrating on the content. Building, Netflix, building Google, not worrying about the actual communication protocols and the JavaScript vagaries and differences between browsers implementation. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a certification program, and it's going to be very exhaustive. And then anyone can build a browser and certify that their browser will work with the internet, and then anyone can use it. And voila, you now have Netflix. You've got Google, and it works with Chrome, it works with Safari, it works with Mac, it works with any, of your choice of browser. But for most people, they don't realize that this only happens when you have that flywheel of tests, conformance, certifications, and standards, and it just constantly is running in that background to drive through to that ever higher degrees of interoperability.
This is just a quick question. If this is how he delivers after flying in from the UK last night, just imagine if he didn't have any jet lag. Right? Good man. Sorry, mate.
So I mean, Ralph, you've touched on a few of the questions that have come through from the audience. Quickfire, should or could there be a global open banking standard?
It depends.
Adrian.
Oh, I think it could be done. It'd just be like snapping Lego bricks together if we did it properly and were smart about it.
Okay, cool. And the other one we've talked about. Oh, we've got it.
Yeah, that was me to ask that, but it's in reference to your point on web on web. Well, like web, right? You could develop a standard which could be utilised by everyone. So I was just curious if it's a similar approach.
You're going to give me 60 seconds?
Yeah.
There are 3 parts to a standard when it comes to data sharing. You've got the security, how do we communicate with each other? Basically, think your mobile phone. I can make a call to you, you can make a call to me. The second one's consent and authorization. How do I ask you for something? What's the standards for that? And the third one is functional APIs, i.e. the actual data payloads between BSB and account number, or I'm not sure what the equivalent is in New Zealand. So various degrees of standardization are happening at those levels. From a security standard point of view, pretty much you now have global interoperability. Everyone's aligned to the financial grade API security profile. For the consent process, it's falling into 2 categories, and we'll see it's like VHS and Betamax, but one of those 2 patterns will win out. From a functional API point of view, I'm not sure we're ever going to get to true functional interoperability across every single jurisdiction. You've got different standards. ISO tries to create, 22022 tries to create a standard for financial services, but doesn't cover all financial services, and likewise, there isn't one for energy, telco, or all these other different markets. But don't worry about that. That's the 5%. And if you're a developer trying to interact between the differences between an account record in Australia and Brazil or New Zealand, if you can standardize the 95%, me getting through that front door, me being able to ask for the sharing of this information, the fact that the actual final payloads are slightly different doesn't really matter.
Okay, let's go to another question that's come through. So we touched on a little bit there in some of Ralph's conversation around the need of a competent regulator. So there's a question here around, does the seemingly lack of coherence between industry and the government / regulators show that New Zealand is not committed to open banking? And are we just happy with the status quo of 4 dominant players who are financially stable? So actually, I was going to go to Adrian for that one.
Yeah, go.
So what was the first part of the question again, Holly? Sorry?
Does the seemingly lack of coherence between the industry and government/regulators show that New Zealand is not committed to open banking?
I raised that in my points earlier around sort of siloed regulators. I believe that. I believe each regulator is doing their utmost within their lane. And I think everyone's so focused on trying to solve for the problems directly in front of them that it's not everyone's taking that step back and having a broader view of, well, how does this impact across the piece? Now, I'm happy to report that one of the last times I was in Auckland, I walked into one of the local bars, the Brit, and 4 of the regulatory bodies were all in there having a beer. And I walk in like, regulators mount up, but I'm like a kid from the 90s. That was funny to me. It wasn't funny to the regulators in the bar. They didn't quite seem to understand the joke. But I genuinely believe there's efforts going on to figure this stuff out, but it's probably not as cohesive as I would like. And I think we could do better in that regard. But obviously each has slightly different remits depending on the context of how they operate. And what was the second half of the question, Holly?
It was around, are we just happy with the status quo of 4 dominant players who are financially stable?
I think collectively, I don't think we are as a nation. I think there's a desire to say, well, actually, we're hearing all these stories, we're hearing different folks and different media saying, actually, New Zealand deserves better, New Zealanders deserve better. What's the art of the possible? And so, are we comfortable? I would say largely the zeitgeist would say no, but then, guaranteed if there was another global financial crisis, everyone would sort of flee to the 4 major banks because they're pretty certain they're not going to go anywhere. And I think that was our great lesson in the UK right after the GFC. We called it the flight to quality, but it was the flight to safety. You went to a big bank where you knew your money was safe. And so I think in times of stress and uncertainty, there will be a greater dependency on the larger banks, but in times where it's a little less restrictive, not times we'll say at peacetime, then in peacetime people are more willing to have a look at what is the art of the possible. Thanks, Ollie.
Thank you. Maybe as a follow-on question that we've had come through, Colin, I'm going to throw this one to you. Do you think banks see open banking as a risk in terms of increasing competition? And does that play into why it's taking so long for open banking to deliver?
To be honest, I think so. I'm not deeply entrenched in it in the way that Adrian and Ralph are. So I'm really looking just as a consumer, from the outside looking in. But I do think that there's an element of that, I think, with the big 4. There are risks, there are investments to make. So I think that is in part to do with it. And I think some of that is not necessarily looking at risk from a competitive perspective, if you like, but actually looking internally and looking at their own risk profile and the risk of changing something. There's a kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, understandability, if you like, with what goes on. So I do think that there's I think in part. I will just a comment on, are we, on the previous question really, on open banking and whether, we're motivated. As a nation, we are used to punching above our weight. We are used to coming in as the underdog and fighting our way up. And I absolutely, I would love to see that, as fellow New Zealanders, we give that support to Kiwibank, TSB, Cooperative Bank, and so on, and the emerging banks, the challenger banks of, Emerge and Dosh and so on. I mean, we've got to give them a try. It's our duty to do that, and I think that flows all the way from a minister's office to us on the street.
I personally don't think that the banks, in my experience with all the markets we've implemented, actually some of the biggest proponents and supporters of open banking have been the actual banks. Certainly in the UK and definitely in Brazil. There's a lot of ancillary benefits that go along with these programs, The UK and Brazil have all their banks are now sitting on significantly upgraded tech stacks. Yes, there was a very large number attributed to the implementation costs, but if you look on the whole, CTOs in all the major banks looked at this as a golden opportunity to get their wish list to put everything into the compliance budget to really sort of shore up their own digital offerings. And as a result of that, certainly in the UK, it doesn't really matter which of the major banks you go to now, you can get quite delightful customer user experiences on all of the major mobile phone, solutions. So when I talk to banks in jurisdictions that are implementing this or considering this, we always try to paint and look at open banking holistically in terms of all the benefits that it can bring, both for the existing bank's stability, the existing bank's ability to innovate internally. Remember, if you've got a great API program that you can now use to share data with third parties, hey, well, they don't have to be regulated. They can be commercial propositions. They can be, new and exciting new services. You can engage with fintechs to act as distribution channels for your non-regulated mandated products. There's lots of different ways that different banks are, that you can educate banks, but that banks eventually come round to seeing this as an opportunity for a lot of other benefits rather than, realistically, rather than a threat.
And what about if we bring that to the consumer, and what does that mean for the benefit for the consumer? So one of the questions we've got here is around the behaviour change open banking has delivered overseas and how that's helped improve financial outcomes, and what can we expect those to deliver for New Zealanders. So Ralph, I'll come to you first, and then Adrian after that.
Different consumers have benefited from in different ways, and it really depends on the value proposition that's being created. A big segment in the UK was thin credit files. So one of the sectors that was massively underserved was the military. You can be a general serving the British Army and have absolutely no credit history because you've been pasted all around the world, have lots of money in your bank but never needed to borrow anything, don't have a credit card because everything's been paid for you, so you come back to the UK and want to get a mortgage. Sorry, sir, very much, sir, but you are out of luck. Good luck. You don't exist here as from a financial point of view. So, can we use digital data to be able to enable alternative lenders or even some of the big banks to actually analyse somebody's payments history, or just pull in all of the bank account fees to make alternative ways of making credit decisions. And actually, we see a lot of the large banks using exactly those technologies and exactly those capabilities to then expand their lending portfolios to cover more, what are quite often less risky, safer consumer credit choices, or markets to expand their offerings and to expand their reach. The same also applies to simplification of payments, reductions of fraud. HMRC is one of and the government is one of the biggest users of open banking now in the UK, and I certainly use it to pay my taxes from a one click. All the details are all set correctly, millions saved in terms of incorrect reference numbers. But it really depends on who the consumer is and what the value proposition is. My needs are relatively simple, but others are not so.
So, Adrian, maybe just to build on that, how do you think open banking can be used to improve financial inclusion, particularly underserved populations?
I think it goes without saying, right? Underserved populations exist for a reason. Like, if you look in the context of New Zealand, 99% of New Zealanders are banked, and the 1% who aren't-ish, they typically come out of situations like out of prison, etc., which makes it really, really hard. Having said that, though, open banking can do things like provide access to mobile wallets and payment services and budgeting tools, and you can, bypass traditional banking barriers. Like coming to Brazil, since I know Ralph had a lot of work over there, the Pix payment system, how good is that? You can use a smartphone to send and receive payments, including the unbanked. And then also to Ralph's other point around tapping the transaction data to then build different credit profiles and transactions, such as rental utility payments. Like Credit Kudos in the UK uses open banking to offer alternative credit scoring for those who may not have access by traditional means. Other things you can do is you can use the rich data from open banking to create tailored financial products. Again, to Ralph's point, like look at those gig workers or those with lumpy income. Like if you look at, say, M-Pesa in Kenya, they use their open banking integration to offer tailored services for microloans and insurance, again, to these underserved populations, and they do it via mobile wallets again. So all of this access to data and capability can only be a good thing from an accessibility perspective for those who are underserved.
Thank you. So we'll come to another question now that's come through, and Colin, I think this is probably best for you. So we often talk about open banking. How about implication and vision for open data enablement? For example, with telco, insurance, energy, with CBDC on the way, what about the overlay of identity? Is a best focus on true interoperability to address all API standards for all?
Wow, that's a huge question.
There's a
I'm
lot
not
in
even
there.
sure I consumed all of that. But if we can sort of kind of perhaps try and take it in chunks, but you may have to repeat some of that. There, you know, to Ralph's point that he made earlier, I'd love to think that that the reason why, you know, digital identity isn't mentioned in the context of open banking more is because everyone recognises that it's effectively in the same payload as the requests, but the reality is that is not the case. You know, it would be lovely if it was, but the reason why open banking, why digital identity isn't mentioned more, is that I think from a policy perspective, that it's just something that's done. You know, I think that there's less understanding in many agencies. Certainly DIA understands digital identity very well. There's no question of that. But you know, it's also a very big agency with, you know, different branches, and different branches have different levels of understanding. And then the further you go out, you know, it's just something that's done. Oh, well, it's DIA's problem to sort out, or it's the bank's problem to sort out, and it sort of kind of flies under the radar. The fundamental unfortunate fact is that it's actually pretty critical, because without the digital identification and verification, you don't have the necessary trust to run across the system. So it's so needed, if you like, and it's from a perspective of how you tackle this. I think actually sort of at a development sense, at a technical sense, is a pretty good understanding of its importance. But the further you go up the chain of command, be it in a company or in an agency, probably get less understanding of how that is. So, you know, one thought of how do you give it extra prominence, and I was thinking, with FMA CEO speaking this morning, COFA is led by the FMA, so COFA, the Council for Financial Regulators, and there you've got in the room basically, you've got MB, RBNZ, who else you've got, Treasury, Comcom. You've basically got the players in the room. You could invite DIA along as well, and you could have that higher level conversation of understanding how digital identity fits into all their projects, be it CBDC for RBNZ, be it CPD for MB, be it the Digital Identity Services Trust Framework, DISTF, whichever way you want to pronounce it, for DIA. So you sort of kind of, you need that sort of kind of high level prominence, which it doesn't currently have. So that's I think that's a case in point where there's the necessary orchestration isn't happening. And if you've read the CPD discussion document that's due for submission tomorrow, and I'll say that Digital Identity New Zealand, supports it. We have some constructive criticism in some areas, which have been brought out by our members, but primarily, it's on the right track, and it's a good thing, and it'll be a obviously it's going to be a nudge for open banking. forgotten my track, but the point was that we're going to be seeing a lot of these things sort of move together, if you like. I hope in more unison. And if you look in the CBD, there's this reliance of, the digital identity question of CBD is neatly solved because we'll be aligning with the Digital Identity Services Trust framework. Well, great, but what happens if that doesn't get adoption? Right, what's the plan B, right? We're all hoping that the DISTF, is widely adopted and goes forward, but we can't be sure of that. So, we've got to do better than just saying, oh, well, we'll just flick it to internal affairs and they'll sort it out.
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to build on that because we've got quite a few questions that are coming through. So, obviously, there's a lot of frauds and scams happening out in the market here. So, we're getting told not to reveal your data. The question here is really around how do you think about open banking can deal with the contradiction of revealing your data? What role does open banking play in terms of addressing fraud, and how can we deal with that contradiction given the large-scale number of frauds and scams that are happening? So maybe, Ralph, I'll come to you first on that one.
Thanks. No, look, so fundamentally, all these different data sharing ecosystems that have been put in place just enable communication between parties. And that's fundamentally how we need to tackle fraud. No one really has the complete side of the picture when it comes to, addressing fraud. In the UK, you've got a system called confirmation of payee, which sits on a very similar rail to the open banking type ecosystem. And that allows participants to message amongst each other whilst a payment's being made to say, hey, I'm about to send you some money. Do these details match? And quite often, fraudsters, and a big target for fraudsters is just swapping the sort code and account number, or BSB and account number, and leaving the name, the name behind. And most faster payment networks don't do name to account checking intrinsically. So leveraging, and there was one of the last implementations I did in the UK, was implementing confirmation of payee allowed these participants to communicate with each other. So when you say how does open banking facilitate this, well, open banking needs to be defined. But if you define it as a data sharing ecosystem that facilitates authorized and unauthorized communication of information between participants, well, that's really the rub. We need to talk more. We need to implement services that allow the communication of signals between participants, so that everyone can start building up a more holistic picture of fraud. And this doesn't have to relate to banking. So, for example, why can't I have a telco or a phone number score? Ping the telcos. Hey, any information about this number? Is it a new number? SIM swap recently? Transition? Oh, I'll use that to inform this particular transaction that's going through. So fraud is about communicating, and combating fraud is about communicating information as much as implementing fancy AI or machine learning to do behavioral analytics. And hey, if a bank has implemented a new fraud engine that can detect it, why not share that information to help make the entire ecosystem safe using open banking or some other form of communication?
Cool, thank you. So
just a quick comment there, because just not sure whether Ralph was aware that Payments New Zealand's Next Gen Payments program actually has confirmation of payee on the path. So be aware that that's certainly the intention here.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the benefits of open banking and some of the consumer value propositions that are able to be enabled off the back of it. There's a question here around, it feels like the New Zealand public is not informed about some of the benefits that can come with open banking. So I guess the question, the build on from that I have is, where do we think the responsibility lies in terms of driving that awareness of open banking and what it can do Is it the banks? Is it the regulators? Where should that sit? So, Adrian, I might come to you for that one.
Yeah, my answer isn't a straightforward sort of slam dunk here, because I tend to think about customer adoption through the lens of open banking, and I think of it through the lens of the book 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. So he's the co-founder of PayPal and a VC. And he always asserted that in order to overcome the inertia of existing habits, a new product had to be 10 times better than what exists today. And so for me, it's an imperative of the API providers and the third parties to build customer experiences that make it really, really easy and intuitive for customers to engage with them. And so our view is whatever is built, it needs to solve a genuine human problem. It can't be a case of, well, we've got some whizzy tech guys, let's go find a problem for it to solve. It has to put the problem first. As an example, you could rock up to an e-commerce retailer with an embedded payment solution that is marginally cheaper than what they have today, and chances of landing a deal are pretty slim because they're already collecting revenue. But if you can evidence increased shopping cart conversion using your embedded payment solution, which materially lowers shopping cart abandonment by, say, 20-30%, then you've got something. And so from our perspective, we're very keen on sort of saying, look, you've got to solve a problem. It's got to be meaningful. And you need to be able to show people, like, for us, the point around educating New Zealanders, where does the responsibility fall? I think it's a case of just build it, show them. That's our view. Show them, don't tell them, show them. And if the benefit's not self-evident to the builder and the API provider, then you've got work to do. But we feel like it's a combined effort between all parties to this. So not only the API providers and the third parties that build the business, but if the government, the regulators, and everyone can get involved and get on the pitch like they tend to do now, I think that gives us a far greater chance of driving that consumer adoption. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Yeah, 30 seconds. It really does. It's a combined effort, but it's a combined effort starting with the regulation. You need to make sure that, if you're all going to be promoting the good things about open banking, that there's no one sticking really scary signs in front of your consumers saying, don't use this. Are you sure? Are you sure? Are you really sure? Can I ask you one more time? Well, maybe I shouldn't do this. So if Adrian wants to get his, high conversion rates, we need to be, making sure that everyone's playing by the rules and everybody is actually on message, and that is promoting this as a safe, secure way of sharing data. And again, people ask, well, how did Brazil get such high adoption? Well, 12 months before they went live, and the second they started building the program, they're doing TV ads, they're doing comms, all paid for by the Brazilian government trying to drive through adoption of what this thing called open banking is, and to explain the security characteristics of it. And they did that very early on to really sort of build a brand around this and to educate consumers well before you started seeing services come online. And again, that lesson learned was from experience based from the UK, where not every bank was aligned to it. They had 14 different consent screens, one bank, and it was very scary language and on it went. And there was no brand recognition with consumers for open banking. So if you solve those, carry on.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I don't recall when you and we were there, I don't recall the UK actually doing TV ads or anything on open banking. No, I don't. Yeah, because we're all there. So, no, they do now. Right. Okay, so here's the thing. I mean, it's just an idea, right? Now, you're not going to, if you go and ask the government for money to put TV ads, on for open banking, we probably all in this room know the answer to that. But, NetSafe can put ads on TV, right? One way that the regulator, if the regulator was sort of kind of, thinking this through, then there might be, well, maybe we make it a condition from the banks that they all throw $1 million into the pot to do a nationwide, TV, social media, TikTok, campaign on open banking. Maybe that's that kind of little nudge that would be the kind of notion to say, okay, yep, we're in this and we're going to show this together.
Okay, just very quickly then, is there anything that consumers can do to help make open banking go faster?
Is that aimed at me?
I was looking at Ralph or Adrian. What do you want to take?
Well, I was going to say, each consumer is out there. If you're interested and want to find out more, go talk to your bank, your API provider. Are we involved in this? Can I do stuff? What can I do through you, my banking provider? I think that's the easiest way consumers get involved is raise it up with who banks them.
From my perspective, look, Kiwis are some of the most mobile people on the planet. You go, you come, you travel, you see different services, and you see different ways of that you can engage in financial services. And a big market that you obviously visit is the United Kingdom, and you see what financial services are available there, how they work, how they interoperate, how they perform. From a consumer point of view, when you come home, it would be demanding the same level of service, to be demanding the same customer experience, to be demanding the same sort of ease of integration that you can see other markets are adopting and incorporating, and asking your banks and also your politicians and regulators, well, if it can be done there, why can't it be done here? Why can't I have the same sort of experiences at home that I get abroad? We talk about earlier levelling up New Zealand. Well, it starts with us demanding that all of our provisions of services are levelled up, and we hold everyone across the board to a higher standard of account.
Cool, thank you. So we've got another couple of questions here. So one is around, do we think within New Zealand we have the internal capability to facilitate this? I'm assuming that means open banking via the government entities. So, do we have the right capabilities here in New Zealand to drive the conversations with the regulators and with government? So Adrian, I'm going to come to you first on that one, and then given your involvement in a lot of these conversations.
I think we do, and I think what's impressed me about my work with the regulators from a BlinkPay perspective is there's a real appetite and desire to learn, and there's a willingness to listen and to consider context and perspectives. And so as long as the regulator and all those folks who are doing that sort of stuff are out there and they're seeking advice and guidance and they're trying to take in as many perspectives as possible, then I think we're into a winning situation here. One of the challenges that we need to contemplate within New Zealand is we need to consider all the context. When you're a regulator and you're the government, you have to consider the 100%. When we're a startup, we consider the little wedge where we start, and then we sort of build out from there. But as a regulator, you have to allow for all those perspectives and then those contexts, and then try and synthesize those into something meaningful. And if I look at, as an example, the ComCom into investigation into the personal banking services market survey, where they began or where they've gotten to is like almost night and day, because they took that feedback, they took that context and said, okay, what can we do within our capabilities and scope of work to be able to do something meaningful in this space? Thanks, Holly.
Cool, thank you. Okay, and probably more of a comment, I think, here from Matthew. So thank you. Payments New Zealand will not be launching Confirmation of Pay into New Zealand. It's NZBA. It'll be start being launched before the end of this calendar year. So I think, look, that's good news for everyone. And thank you, Matthew, for the clarification there. Look, we've got a few minutes left, so please do ping through any final questions that you've got. One of the last ones that we've got here is around what opportunities does open banking have for small fintech businesses and other roles such as legal, privacy, risk roles. So, Ralph, any perspectives on that?
So coming back to one of the earliest questions, if it is implemented correctly, or if it is implemented with an interoperability imperative that's high on the agenda, then well, you're talking about laying new digital railroads. So once those digital railroads, are in the process of being rolled out, then all sorts of different propositions can be brought to market depending on what the fintech is seeing inside, demand for. I think the big benefit for fintechs is that if it is implemented correctly, they don't spend all their money getting to the starting line. They start with libraries. They start with, toolkits. They start with, a consistent single set of code that can talk to all of the different providers in a specific sector. They're not wasting time and energy making connectivity work. We don't fight with dial-up modems anymore, or most of us don't. We don't fight with different browsers working with different websites. It just works. We pick it and go, and then we actually spend our time and effort engaging with that content provider in value, creative or additive type functions. That's the benefit of an interoperable. Let's not call it open banking, but an interoperable data sharing ecosystem.
Cool. Thank you.
I would just add to that I think because privacy and consent, notice and consent is really important, part of building that trust. And it's a necessity to bring those standards and protocols or sit them inside the existing ones, so that it's part and parcel. We've got to, as a nation, it feels we talk so much about notice and consent, but we actually do very little with it, really. And here's an opportunity where we really can, because we're down the track with standards, with protocols, with data exchange, in this open banking, emerging open banking ecosystem, and we can drive in notice and consent in a nice, structured way that's going to pay huge dividends long term.
So final question, just to wrap up, and I'll go across the panel for their responses. Where do you hope open banking will be in New Zealand in 5 years' time from now?
Fully implemented.
Colin?
Yes, I'm not qualified to say, but I will support Ralph with fully implemented. Be lovely, wouldn't it? Would be lovely. Whether we get there remains to be seen.
So, can I just, sorry, Jason, 2 seconds. I'm being slightly facetious. The start of this is a journey, and if you look at what Brazil has done and other markets have done, they recognise that this is the start of a journey, and that journey in 5 years' time, I hope we don't say it's fully implemented. I hope the digitisation and consumer data right, whatever you want to call it, in New Zealand is still trucking on, but we've had successful implementations into certain sectors, and we're moving on to potential other sectors. So, being a bit facetious in terms of the definition of fully implemented, because I don't really know what that means, because it's never really fully implemented. It can go and grow how New Zealanders demand it, and it may go in different directions. The minister said, what was it, telco and energy, but actually you as citizens may say, actually healthcare is far more important. Can you give us open health? I want to be able to do health innovation because that gives better value for us as citizens. And it's really up to you where you take it for New Zealand, but I really do hope in 5 years' time it's not stopped. The train is still moving.
Thank you. And Adrian, come to you for your final words on it.
My hope is that it's embedded and ubiquitous.
Wonderful. So look, thank you all so much for your insights there. Some great questions, and thank you to the audience for your participation. Hopefully we answered your questions satisfactorily. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much for attending.